by 2040, it's going to be almost 70% of the population would be considered urban. And you can see here satellite image of artificial light at night that's composite. And, there's a lot of planet, but most of them live in urban areas. And so one of my big points that I'm going to make is that cities are the answer. Often you're going to hear that say, well, cities, this is where most of the trace gas fluxes are coming from, yada, yada, yada. But I'm going to make an argument that we need to look at it differently. And soil is a very critical part of making cities the answer. So in developing sustainable cities and human settlements, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Another thing I'm going to touch on is because my major advisor working on my PhD used to say climate has already changed in our cities. This is back in the late 90s. I'm sorry, early 90s. And when climate change was just beginning to be publicly recognized. And in fact, we've talked about using it as an analog when we study these forest patches along urban-rural gradients. So I'll talk more about that. And I'll talk a little bit more about climate change effect on urban soils. And of course, it always depends on how that might. I said I'm going to be presenting research and data on urban soils, but we have a lot to do to answer some of these questions. So I'll start with the importance of cities. And so when people think about cities, I'm sure you all heard about ecological footprints. And so basically an ecological footprint of a city relates to the inputs that go into the city. So these natural resources, food, and whatever come from outlying rural areas. And this is by Newman, 1999. By the way, so these are old, but they I think tell the story that I'm trying to project here. And then there's also these outputs. So we have air waste, water waste, solid waste, waste heat, and together that constitutes the footprint of cities. And so there were all kinds of papers that were being published in the late 90s, early 2000s about how cities were just horrible because of their ecological footprint. But the question is, really, it should be, how do we minimize these footprints? How do we minimize into city, and how do we minimize those outputs and make them more sustainable? Ecological response of ecosystems, urban ecosystems, to higher temperatures, bigger range in temperatures, higher CO2 and air pollution, longer growing seasons, and weather events, et cetera. And we in the urban ecology field consider this ecology in the city. So we're doing whatever you do outside the city in ecological systems, you can do in cities because there's nature there, whether regardless of pavement or whatnot. We could do what we do more natural systems as ecologists, all scientists in the city. But then there's this ecology of the city, and this includes the human component. And so this then relates to, as far as climate change, to adaptation, and that means adapting to climate change. And then there's mitigation, which is reducing climate change. So you want to reduce, for example, trace gas fluxes. And then there's this idea, which is ecology for the city. So when we were doing research in a Baltimore ecosystem study, went through all these phases: ecology in the city, of the city, and ultimately we wanted the research to be used. And that getting used is for the city. And for change, this relates to capacity to prepare for, respond to, and recover from the impacts of climate events, and so on and so forth. So there's in the city, of the city, and for the city. Soils play a big role in all of this, and I'll show you that in this slide. So we have adaptation here and mitigation. And this, I'm borrowing this from Green Strategies. I got this online. And so the thing, cities and their importance is that this is where the people live. 65% of the world's population in urban areas. In the United States, that's 80%. And in Europe, it's even higher. So this is where most of the people live. So adaptation becomes very, very important. And mitigation becomes very, very important. That's also where all the people live. And we want to, again, reduce those footprints, the inputs and outputs, and can play a role in a lot of these adaptation and mitigation strategies. And I'm just circling them here, and we could talk more about this later. But in the middle, as you can see in the middle there, where these two adaptation and mitigation circles intersect, that's where green infrastructure, green solutions become very, very important. And so brown, what I call brown infrastructure, fits into that. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. But just to give you an idea of why I think cities are the answer is because basically in higher density, the footprint on a capita basis is much better in urban areas. So if you compare people that live in higher density cities, and I put a line there because that's where the line starts to flatten out. So once you get beyond, say, 6,000 people per square kilometer, you really start to get more sustainable, getting closer to we're greatly reducing the emissions per capita, which is on the left-hand side there. So places like Los Angeles and Chicago are producing way more emissions per capita than these cities to the right. And so that makes them ultimately sustainable. But if you compare it to people that live in rural areas, Los Angeles is doing better. So I don't have that data to show you right now, but take my word for it. Cities on a per capita basis, there's less CO2 emissions. So if we look now on a global scale, and now I'm looking at carbon, because obviously carbon plays a big role in climate change. And these are numbers I've been updating the years. Originally, I got this figure from Schlesinger and way back in 2000. And so we can see here fluxes with arrows and sinks with the capital letters. And so the sinks for carbon biosphere is in the atmosphere, plants, and in soils, and that's a 1 meter depth. So soils by far the largest sink of carbon on a global scale in the biosphere. And if we look, for some reason, up to the left of the 1 meter, 2 meters depth, it's actually 2,500. And this is in petagrams. So petagrams are 10 to the 15 grams, to give you an idea. So if we look at the amount of that's been released in soils due to agriculture, so the history of agriculture on the planet based on human activity, there's been a release of about 133 petagrams. And that's a significant, obviously, the agricultural sector, there's a lot of room to play to building up, bringing some of that carbon back into soils. And if we compare that to fossil fuel emissions since the Industrial Revolution, it's not as significant, but roughly a quarter of that. But the question here is, how does urban land use change the carbon cycle on a continental scale? And so here's a map by the Natural Resource Conservation Service on solar and carbon stocks for the lower 48 states. And you can see their depth, they're in centimeter, 10 centimeter delineations. And this data, by the way, is already old. They have much better data. When they came out with this map in 2013, there wasn't as much available. But if you overlay urban areas on top of that, what we find in a Churkina et al. Paper, and this is the latest paper that I could find, where the land carbon is stored in urban settlements and human settlements, which is about 18 PG, 64% of which in the soil. And that's using our data from 2006. So we have a lot of updating that we really need to do here. But that suggests that urban soils constitute about of all soils in the lower 48 states. And of course, the footprint would be, roughly represented by these artificial light satellites. So urban soils are a relatively small percentage of the carbon equation relative to ag soils. But this is where, again, people live. And of course, people that are living in these densely populated areas are being supported by agricultural soils outside the city. This all relates to the footprint. So now I want to talk a little bit about ecosystem services and how all this how soils relate to these services. And of course, there's provisioning, regulating, and ecosystem services, and they're all supported by the natural systems that people are living on or with. And so we have nutrient cycling, soil formation, productivity. This is right out of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2005. And soils play a big role in this. When we take a look at an urban landscape, this is what we came up with the group I was working. We break it down into working ecosystems, eco-engineered ecosystems, and what we call amenity ecosystems. Of course, and then there's the supporting ecosystems, which again, that's where the soils come in. So we have working, and this is what, provides, so we could from rather than importing it. So that's why urban agriculture becomes very important. I'll talk more about victory gardens in a minute. We have these eco-engineered ecosystems, which are basically, for the engineers in the audience, is basically to get more out of what we after we urbanize the landscape. There's amenity ecosystems, which are more social, science-oriented kinds of things. So how can we minimize footprint with urban soils? And so local food production becomes a really big one. So that's where urban agriculture comes in. So instead of importing food, you're actually growing it within the system. Stormwater runoff, because that ends up in wastewater, water that goes into creeks systems that are downstream. And this would include rain gardens and things like that. There's soil enrichment. So composting is a really big deal to recycle organic waste, to tighten nutrient cycles. And a really big methane emitter, by the way, are landfills, because people throwing in food waste, which feeds methanotrophic kinds of things, and it releases methane. The importance of cultural services in urban areas. So can utilize soils. I always push, where 80% of the population lives, this place to teach about soil science, which we did a lot in Baltimore. And I do want to get a little bit more, give you a little bit more information on in small plot agriculture, what I small plot agriculture. For those of you who aren't familiar with this idea of victory gardens, in World War II, actually it was in World War I as well, so this was started as work for the front in World War II to help prevent foods for the troops and elsewhere around the world. So it helped people stretch food ration coupons at the time in World War II. There's only a limited amount of food you can purchase at a store. And at its peak, started 1941, at its peak in 1945, more than 20 million were started in the United States. Yes, this was not only in urban areas, it was in small towns around the country as well. But here's the big thing that I want to talk to you about, is that over 1 million tons of produce were being produced. And that was 40% of all the vegetables being grown in the United States at that time. So the potential to grow produce in small plot agriculture is really, really high. Okay, so let's move out into the urban landscape and talk about what I call the urban soil mosaic. And I call this the new heterogeneity. And I don't have time to get into this. I can do a whole lecture on it. But basically, as we urbanize landscapes, we create a whole different array of soil conditions than a native system would be. And so this is because of management, the whole development process of getting to this landscape. These major disturbances are important as well. But what's really interesting, at least in the United States, where I've done most of my work, there's also often fallow in these urban areas, because there's this transition between one use of the land to another. And so in Baltimore City, Detroit, and other old industrial cities have lots of vacant land. But also there are lots of these corridors where that follow transportation or creeks and rivers and things like that are also relatively undisturbed. And then of course, you have remnants in urban landscapes as well. This is a forest in the city of Baltimore. I'll talk more about that later. But this urban soil mosaic represents an array of patches. So it becomes very patchy. when people move into landscapes and urbanize them because of this idea of land ownership, versus a natural landscape where it's more of a continuum. And as you, for example, go down a slope of a mountain or something like that. So it's very patchy, and it represents the new heterogeneity that I call for soils, because most of our knowledge of how soils change spatially are from natural systems. And so when we get into this condition, it becomes very patchy and different. So we can take that patchiness and we can array those patches in what I call an urban soil continuum. And it goes from direct effects to indirect effects. And so direct effects are those physical kinds of impacts that soil we have on as we develop areas, as we use soils, compact them from the top, for example, or manage them intensely. So those are considered engineered kinds of, not engineered, I'm sorry, those are considered direct effects. And then indirect effects are the environmental changes that accompany urban areas, like, and I'll talk way more about this in a bit, like temperature, deposition, and things like that. And then we can also, so these remnants become very important because we can, we can compare them to a reference, which I'll talk a little bit about later. I thought I had it popping up there of a reference site. But anyway, we can then think about climate change impacts. We can also look at ecosystem services, how they vary across this continuum. And so in my research career, we like to think of this continuum, this urban soil mosaic that constitutes a continuum as we array those patches, as natural experiments. So for example, we can do patch comparisons across remnants, pairing a remnant forest with, say, a turf system. We can compare turf grass systems that are different, that have different site histories or are different ages. So in Baltimore, for example, we had turf grass systems that were in for almost 100 years, and we can compare them with turf grass systems that were only in for 10 years. And so we call that a chronosequence as an example. And we can also array soils within small watersheds, and we can look at what's coming out of a watershed and relate that to the soil patches in that watershed. So we can then address questions of management. We can then address questions of use, and we can also address questions of site history in this urban mosaic. And what's really cool is that these experiments are all set up for us. We don't have to do a thing other than to go out there and look for them and categorize them and then make those comparisons. But even within that, you can do experiments as well, using this urban soil mosaic and continuum as our template for finding these natural experiments. So we did in Baltimore, and you can see on the left-hand side there a map of the city of Baltimore. That black line is the fall line. So to the right of that fall line are coastal origin soils, and to the left, it's Piedmont origin soils. Very different parent material types. And these black circles were plots where we collected vegetation data, but we also collected soil data. And so if we take all the data that occurred, we take all that data and we look at the mean, median, and we look at minimum, maximum values, various soil characteristics, what really struck us was the wide range that we find in that landscape. And so up until this point in time, people were trying to define what an urban soil was. But we were showing with these data that there is no such thing as a typical urban soil, wide range of factors out there. And so bulk density, wide range from 0.71, can't see it because the thing is covering, there we go, to 1.74. That's a really huge difference in bulk density, for example. pH, wide range. You never find something like that in a forest. So the other thing is, if we look at the median for each of these things, one of the big definitions up until that time of an urban soil was it was depleted of nutrients. Well, if you look at this data, the numbers in parentheses are the recommended range that you would want for a garden, for producing vegetables. And look at the numbers: potassium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. These are medians, obviously. Minimums suggest that in a lot of places we're deficient in those cations. However, there's a lot of places in that landscape where they're not deficient. So just to give you an example. And so what we did is we used a canonical discriminant analysis, and we were able, with the same data, to differentiate, generalized categories of those patches in that mosaic that I was telling you about. And so we were able to show, do you see my cursor there? I hope. That we were able to differ forest sites, makes sense, right, from grass sites, for grass-dominated sites. And these are variables down here that differentiated them: phosphorus, potassium, and that's bulk density. So the bulk density was much higher in these than in the forest. You'd expect that. But phosphorus and potassium are parts of formulated fertilizer for turfgrass systems. And so we were finding that there's been a buildup in phosphorus and potassium. So that kind of explains the earlier slide I showed, where we're getting a lot of cations in that landscape. And the other interesting thing was what differentiated grass that wasn't in residential areas. So these were, off sides of roads and things like that, other places, compared to residential grass, it was pH and calcium. So it was pH in the other grass category than residential grass. So what comes in with concrete? So calcium is a big component of concrete, for example. And so I think this is reflecting the great importation, there's that footprint again, right? Bringing in of calcium in the form of concrete for building structures, and it ends up in our urban landscape. So this is the kind of interesting thing that you could see. And then there was bare soil. We only had 2 plots there. So we can also look at a functional response in that landscape. And this is not in Baltimore. This is an example of Weissert et al. 2015. And I think this was in Australia. Can't remember. But the CO2 flux is the variable here. And so they compared parkland, a sports field, an urban forest, and wood chip mulch. So you can go out and differentiate these patches looking at CO2 fluxes as well. And we get these interesting patterns. I'll come back to that a little later. So going back to these natural experiments, and now more zeroing in on the climate change question, is we can also look at, remember we saw remnants within that urban landscape of forest in Baltimore. In New York City, we had a remnants in, so this area, this figure here is the Bronx, New York, South Bronx right here. There's Manhattan in the background. In the foreground is a New York Botanical Garden forest, which was an uncut forest. So this is a mature, old-growth forest growing in these urban conditions for the last 200 years. And then we can go in suburban areas, and then we can pick our rural reference sites to compare that with. So we call this an urban-rural gradient, which is an environmental gradient that's set up by these urban impacts, potential for urban impacts. So we can compare a forest to suburban and a rural. And these are relatively undisturbed forests. These are just growing within the context of those landscapes. And so as an example, we looked at soil temperature, and this is in Baltimore. We also had an urban rural gradient in Baltimore, and we could see that the urban grass sites were way warmer than the rural forest sites. So temperature gradient. We also had, and just giving you some examples, there's a lot more I could show you, especially with heavy metals, but I don't have time. But this is through-fall nitrogen. This is nitrogen that's coming through the canopy of those forest patches. In New York City, look at that black bar to the left here compared to the rural site. There's a big difference in the amount of nitrogen coming into the system. Now, this got a little bit of a bump over the suburban because there was a electric power plant not far from some of my rural sites, which I didn't plan on, but that's what happens. The other thing we were able to measure calcium coming in through particulates, fine particulates, and calcium followed a similar pattern. Again, these areas are sources of calcium because probably a concrete being brought in. And I'm just showing that this was replicated in Boston, same kind of research. But what's really interesting is that they went out into the landscape, not just underneath forests, and they showed a wide range, even though they're all elevated, but it was way more variance here in this urban landscape, which I can call the new heterogeneity. So that's all the entire landscape, not just forest patches. So what we're finding then in these urban areas, the length of growing season has been increased because of temperature, and a reduction and then the minimum temperatures have been raised quite a bit. And so we can have all kinds of impacts. Species that normally might not exist in the native habitats what the city replaced, but because of these environmental changes, they can get established there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And so we can have then a leapfrog of habitats. So in 1989, when I was setting up my dissertation sites outside of New York City area, I was greeted in my urban plot with the Asian tiger mosquito, Aedes albopictus. I was one of the first people to observe this in these areas. They were supposed to be living there. Were introduced into 1985, which they think were in tires, because tires were old tires that were being imported from, I think, Puerto Rico to be processed, reprocessed into something else. Of course, tires collect water, small pools of water, and that's all you need for mosquitoes to reproduce. And so this is where they think it got introduced. By the time I was doing my research, they had already spread to New York City metropolitan area. They are a subtropical species. So how on earth were they growing and serving in New York City? Well, because the New York City environment has changed. And so the same could be true for soil organisms as well. And as it turns out, it has happened. And so if we look at invasive species, this is work by Kathy Slavitz, and I was co-author in this work. And we also did work in New York City, Steinberg. Steinberg was a student of mine. And earthworm, other taxa, and soil organisms. Kathy is an expert in diplopoda, or isopoda, for example. And so in New York City, 100% of the earthworms that we've in our forests were from somewhere else. And that's because the last glaciation had traveled as far south as New York. And the idea is that glaciation killed all the native worms that were there. And it takes worms a long time to disperse into different areas without people. And so a lot of places north of that last glacial period, native earthworms simply don't exist. But we're finding invasive species. So Baltimore, it's 57%, and we also compare it to Budapest, which is 19%. So the species were Amynthus, which are from Asia, again, a little bit more adapted to warmer climates. We're finding them widely dispersed now, and they're called Asian jumping worms. And you might have seen headlines in newspapers and magazine articles about that. But what has occurred because of these localized climate changes, and because people have a tendency to disperse these organisms because they bring horticultural material. In New York City, see these boats here? Soil way back when in the late 1800s was used as ballast in sailing ships. So they would come over, empty out their ballast, and then bring in cargo to go back to Europe. Well, in this ballast were all kinds of egg casings for earthworms. And that's how we think they got originally. Some of these species were originally introduced. And of course, we then spread them around because they make good fish bait and so on and so forth. But what's really interesting is this idea of an emerging ecosystem. So we could think of our soil ecological systems, which have, all kinds of organisms. Again, I don't have time to get into that. But because we're urban areas tend to be an epicenter of invasive species introductions, this is where they're coming. The idea of an emerging ecosystem is we're creating these new communities of organisms that never before had to compete with each other and so on and so forth. And so we're creating these emerging ecosystems. And so coevolution and successional trajectories we have no idea where they're going. So this is really exciting area of research. And this is a white-footed mouse over here that has a whole nother story I don't have time to get into, but populations of white-footed mouse are evolving differently than mice outside of urban areas because of environmental and habitat changes. So it's really cool stuff if you're an ecologist and you like this kind of thing. Over here to the left is an Atlantis altissima forest in one of our New York City parks. And this growing underneath is daylily. So I challenge you to find anywhere on the earth Atlantis altissima forests with daylily growing underneath. So this is the idea of these emerging ecosystems, where these species that have never grown or lived together are now doing that. Just then these introductions relate to a loss of ecosystem services. And this is work, again, Kathy Slavitz in Baltimore. We have very similar results in New York, but I don't want to show you all that because I don't have the time. But we find that earthworm biomass and nitrate production. So the earthworms are disturbing soils, creating an environment for nitrifiers to really do their thing. And so we get a lot more nitrification occurring where we have high biomass. And most of that was occurring in these urban and suburban forest patches. So that's a big change by these non-native species of earthworms. And we also tried it with different species of introduced earthworms, and species do matter. These jumping worms really have an impact on nitrification. I don't have time to go through all that data. Plants are the same thing. This is Tara Trammell's work in Louisville, Kentucky. She showed that invaded sites I forgot what the species was, but it was a shrub, versus uninvaded. You can see soil carbon accumulation differed tremendously. So the invasives that come into these systems, the consequences, ecological services, and many of them relate to the soil. In this case, it's soil is the where the carbon's accumulating or not accumulating. So getting back to this question of can urban environments then serve as an analog for climate change, we really wanted to think, we were hoping that we could do that with these urban-rural gradients. And so basically, the advantage of using these urban-rural gradients for this question of how systems are responding to climate change is that it's a whole ecosystem response. We can look at the entire ecosystem and all the feedbacks and all the multiple factor interactions. Now, there's drawbacks to this approach, obviously, because not everything about an urban environment is the same as climate change. And there was a great paper by Margaret Carrero and Chris Tripler, 2005, that addressed that. But I can give you some examples. So climate and environmental change effects on soil is multifaceted. And this is a very old slide that I tried to update because I didn't have time to do it. But anyway, basically, climate change is going to affect plant productivity. It's going to affect litter production and the quality of the litter. We found that in our work. And then that relates to decomposition of organic matter are going to be greater in some cases. And we have this recycling through biological activity and of course, weathering and root exudates and so on and so forth that have an important impact on carbon and other nutrients recycling and so on and so forth. So this is just to show how complicated this is and how it will be very difficult to do an experiment on more than one of these kinds of interactions. And so looking at a whole ecosystem response is very difficult. So what ecologists have done through money through the federal government is done to address that issue. They've used free air enrichment experiments, more well known as FACE experiments, where they look at net primary productivity. They can look at all these different aspects of an ecosystem. In these patches that you see out here are all being enriched by carbon dioxide at different levels. And then these are the controls out here. So they can do these comparisons. But we could do something very similar, I would argue, along these urban-rural gradients, where we know we have a temperature gradient, which translates to a soil temperature gradient. We know we have an atmospheric CO2 gradient. This is data from the city of Baltimore. So you can see very high atmospheric concentrations of CO2 compared to the rural. And so again, can we use it as an analog? This is Lou Ziska, who worked with us in Baltimore. And so he utilized this and set up plots along that gradient to look at ragweed response to climate change. This would be an example of a single species, okay? And he showed that under the rural conditions, so the reference sites, he had less biomass in the more enriched urban sites. And that included pollen being produced by which causes more, of course, allergic reactions in people. So for a single species, we can do that, but how about a whole response? And this is data from our Baltimore plots compared to a rural. We're not doing a whole gradient here. We're just doing an urban versus a rural. And on the right here, these are CO2 fluxes, okay? And these are the urban forests plots here. And then we have methane production or uptake. And so because soil is a sink for methane, these numbers are negative. And what you hear when you look at this is that there's in the rural forests aren't being impacted by these environmental factors in an urban landscape. There's less CO2 flux from the soils. And if we look at the methane, the sink is much higher in the rural than in the urban. And we want bigger sinks because methane is an important trace gas, a greenhouse gas. So by doing a whole ecosystem response, we can, to this environmental gradient, we can make these kinds of comparisons. And then we can add on the effect of management by looking at lawns. And so we looked at the turf grass. So remember that natural experiment I was talking about. Now we can start comparing lawns with forests. And again, this is we think is an environmental response. This is again methane flux, so it's negative. And we find in turf grass systems, we actually had a flux of methane coming out of that, one of our plots. The other ones were small sinks, but way smaller than a forest. So we can do these kinds of things. And so we can then suggest that this is a cover management response. So getting back to that urban soil continuum, we go from undisturbed to engineered. And so indirect effects to direct effects. We find that the hypothesis is that the mitigation potential is greater under these conditions here. So we can engineer systems so that we can mitigate any release of carbon dioxide from soil, from a turf grass system, for example, by engineering the soil, by controlling the management of that turf grass system, and so on and so forth. And then climate change impacts, we would hypothesize, are going to have greater impact on remnants because they're not being managed, and therefore they're just responding to those climate change impacts. And so we hypothesize a greater impact. And of course, we can also compare it to a reference forest like the urban rural gradient that I talked to you about before. So I want to end here with some global scale comparisons that I've been more recently involved with of these kinds of systems. And so it's a research that we did, I did with scientists from Finland, Hungary, and my colleagues in Baltimore. Oh, and also in Potchefstroom, South Africa. And so we have 5 different cities here. 2 of them are in Finland, one in Maryland, Hungary, and South Africa. And what's important note is that these represent very different biomes, okay? Moisture regimes, temperature regimes, and so on and so forth. Different soil orders, different parent material. And so when we compare soils in this natural experiment that I'm about to show you, keep that in mind. And so our base study design, our natural experiment, were 4 habitats that come out of this matrix. So we have a reference, so I've already talked about that. A remnant patch, already talked about that. Turf, and then we added a ruderal, something that's very highly disturbed, massive fill. And we then could look at the environment effect, the ref versus the rem, which I already showed you. We can also look at a disturbance effect versus management. I kind of showed that to you already as well. Turf versus the ruderal, and ruderal versus, now we didn't do perennial, so, but we didn't do all the different examples. So this is just to give an idea of what these places look like. So we have forest in Helsinki, a forest in Budapest. We have a turf, a ruderal in Baltimore. This is a turf in Lahti, Finland. And the native system in Potchefstroom just as is not a forest, it's a grassland. So when we then compare the data across these, make global comparisons, what we are is the idea of convergence, is that when we disturb soils and we create urban environments, it's pretty unified around the world how that happens, what the impacts are on soils. So when you disturb a soil, you tend to lose structure and so on and so forth. And so the idea was that we can compare the coefficient of variation between the reference site, which is representative of the biome, right, to these remnant turf and ruderal sites are in the urban context. And the remnant to reference is much more of a direct comparison like we did in the urban rural gradients research in New York and in Baltimore. And so down here is pH. And so what we found was that there was a convergence. So across those different biomes, the native sites really were different in their pH. And that makes total sense when you're comparing a boreal forest from a steppe grass system in Potchefstroom. But when we go into the urban landscape, the turf grass and ruderal sites, they're much more similar, no matter where you are. And so if we look at pH, interestingly, the native sites were more acidic than the rural sites. Again, this is very consistent to what we found in New York and Baltimore. And so things are getting more basic as you urbanize these landscapes. We also did the same comparison with soil organic carbon. We did this for a lot of different things. This is the last one I'm going to show you. Again, we got convergence. So the cross biomes, the reference sites were very different. The remnant sites a little bit less different. And then, of course, the disturbed and managed sites are way different. And so we got, in this case, a lot of carbon as you disturb these systems. And what we found is that where you have more carbon to lose, you end up losing it, like in Helsinki and Lahti. What the other interesting thing was in Potchefstroom, because the native grass system was the reference, we actually built up carbon relative to the native system because of management, because those turf grass systems were being irrigated versus the steppe grass system, which suffered through droughts and things like that. And so the big question now is, how does climate change impact all this? And we are addressing that question now. So I don't have data to show you that yet.